Hello, business leaders. How are you? My name is Andre Bailey. For those of you that don't know me, I am the founder of Change Everything and of Project Opioid, a community collaboration on the opioid crisis in Central Florida. You'll be hearing a lot more about. We're excited to be here with you today on an exclusive business leader webinar talking about the opioid crisis in Florida and what business leaders need to know. And I've got three very exciting guests with me today. I'll go through them. First of all, Tony Carvajal, Executive Vice President, Florida Chamber Foundation. Peek forward there, Tony, and say hello. All the way from Tallahassee. Drive, fly, how'd you get here?
It was dry today, fortunately. So.
Okay, good weather?
Yes.
Great. Kim Lopdrup, Chief Executive Officer of Red Lobster, whose offices are in Orlando, Florida, but you have how many stores?
We have 750 restaurants.
Wow, and international now.
Yes, we're in 12 countries.
So Kim's headquarters is here in Central Florida, but he's both Florida, around the country, and around the world. Kim is one of the executive leaders of Project Opioid, and he can arrange for you to get free cheese biscuits upon request as well. Then we have Sheriff Dennis Lima from Seminole County. Sheriff Lima, how long have you been sheriff there?
I'm in my first term, so going into my fourth year as sheriff, but 27 years. I was the chief deputy before becoming sheriff.
That's the gray hair, is it 27?
Yeah, that's
But Sheriff Lima, one of the most prolific advocates for solutions to this opioid crisis, Seminole County, right outside of Orange County here in Central Florida. They've seen, like most communities, this opioid epidemic grow, and so he's going to be talking to us from a law enforcement perspective. Tony, from a business leader perspective across the state, and Kim, as an advocate, knowing people who have been affected by this, and again, as a business leader. So, again, the overview, what we're going to be focusing on is going to be what is the scale of this opioid crisis in Florida and why business leaders should care about it, how the opioid crisis can negatively impact a business and why you should be concerned about that as well, how business leaders can make an impact positively on the opioid crisis, why we have to have business leaders involved in this community, Central Florida, around the state of Florida, really and around America if we're going to see progress, and what the range of options those leaders, both business leaders, faith community leaders, and others can bring to the table to solve this crisis. But without further ado, I'm going to, they're reminding me, if you have a question in the GoToMeeting app that you're looking at right now, this webinar is 1 hour long. If you have a question, you can type that question in the GoToMeeting panel, or you can email us and we will be answering your questions live here on the webinar. So, without further ado, again, Sheriff Dennis Lima. Sheriff, talk a little bit about what the opioid crisis looks like here in Florida. I was someone who, until about a year ago, didn't really understand it, didn't understand the scope of the crisis. But as someone who runs a law enforcement agency, what should business leaders know about the opioid crisis that's probably happening right smack dab in the middle of their community?
Yeah. So I'll first say, here in the state of Florida, law enforcement and public safety cannot fix this epidemic without our partners with the business community, the faith-based community, coming together to collaborate on ideas, suggestions, proposals, and best practices. To put this in perspective, I'm going to kind of go back here a few years. It's been about 25 years that we started to become a pain-centric society, where here in the United States, zero pain was what many physicians were after. And this kind of grew when a lot of the medical practices and facilities were being evaluated online based on their clients' experience. And the philosophy at the time was patient knows best. So the only level of sophistication that many facilities had was rate your pain on a scale from 1 to 10. And if you did not recognize that number 1 was minimal amount of pain and 10 was a lot of pain, they put smiley faces and frowns on that form and allowed patients to circle whatever they felt was their experience. I don't know that there's any more subjective of a topic than somebody's level of pain. But what happened is, at the time, Purdue Pharmaceutical came up with a wonder drug, OxyContin. And they convinced physicians that prescribing it as it was designed was less than 0.5% likely to become addictive. It was a few years after that that law enforcement professionals, medical doctors, addiction specialists learned that people were misusing the drug and turning it into nearly pure heroin. And the executives at Purdue did little to combat and address it at the time. As addiction started to spread from legitimate use and legitimate doctors from Appalachia, from Ohio, all the way down to the state of Florida, many of the states in the southeastern area of the United States created what was a prescription pill monitoring system. And at the time, executives at Purdue were found guilty in criminal court of deceptive marketing practices. The person who worked for the Food and Drug Administration, who made the unprecedented statement that it was very unlikely to be addictive, later went to work for Purdue. So there was a kind of a big scam there. But what happened in the state of Florida is we were one of the few states at the time that did not implement a prescription pill monitoring system. And as a result of that, nearly 97% of all of the prescribed prescription pills that were on the streets in the country were prescribed from a pharmacy or a clinic in the state of Florida.
Sheriff, when was this? What year was that?
This really started in the early 2000s and evolved over the past 20 years. So what happened was people would travel from every other state, especially the states that were contiguous to Florida, what was called the Opioid Express, because there was 850 pill mills across the state, and the largest pill mill was down in the Miami area, and it was American Pain. They were just had a really scam going on. So what we did under the leadership of Attorney General Pam Bondi is we closed those pill mills down. The problem is all of those individuals that were in line had already become dependent upon the drug. This happens because 80% of the people who were now turning to street-level drugs were at one time legally prescribed a pain pill, an opioid pain pill, for a legitimate pre-existing condition.
Sheriff, let me just ask you, because I know I can read the minds of a lot of business leaders who this might be their first introduction to the opioid crisis or even addiction in general. Why can't someone, if they started on an opioid, Oxy,
Right.
Their doctor gave it to them, they start taking it and abusing it, why don't they just stop? Why can't that person make a good choice and just stop? Crisis over.
Yeah.
Why is that not the case in your opinion?
And I will tell you, 27 years in this business and looking at addiction, it is how the mind works. There's a center part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala sends signals to the frontal cortex of the brain. Now, the amygdala part of the brain is the area of the brain that has spontaneous response to situations. It's the fight or flight. It's what gives us emotional and physical pain when we lose a loved one, or if we're walking down a dark alley and somebody's walking behind us, it makes us kind of feel a different type of way. Well, addiction occurs in that part of the brain. When the amygdala and the frontal cortex are communicating properly, the frontal part of the brain, the frontal cortex of the brain, is what controls rational thought. Through prolonged and extended use of opioid, it affects the frontal cortex of the brain. So you have individuals that are college graduates, they served in the military, they've had wonderful jobs, finding themselves abandoning their children, sometimes selling their body on the street, and then dying with dirty needles in their arm. There is nobody that is ever born wanting to die with a dirty needle in their arm. Let me talk about the magnitude of this. Across the country, more than 70,000 people have died of an opioid-related overdose. But here in the state of Florida, we are experiencing an all-time low in reported crime. It's a 47-year low in the crime rate. But
So
we are
crime
losing.
is low.
Crime is low.
Addiction and overdose death at its highest point.
I tell you, we have
Fascinating.
never, ever experienced anything like this. Even at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic in the mid-'80s, we're losing 6 times more people now than what we did back then. In the state of Florida, it's 19 people a day that are dying. And I will tell you, here's why they're dying. So you become addicted to the most powerful molecule on the planet, the poppy, the opioid. You're getting your drugs from a physician. The physician then learns, you know what, this is highly addictive and not healthy for you, so I'm weeding you off. The doctor weeds them off. Then, once upon a time, they could doctor shop and go to every single doctor. We put into effect a prescription pill monitoring system which tracks how many pills the patient's getting. and
Florida
how
finally
many-
did that.
Yeah, how many the doctors are giving. So we have that.
Okay.
Now people are turning to street level drugs, not because they're looking for euphoria, because they have become dope sick, where they're trying to get their daily dose of drugs to get to our normal and to function. And this has resulted in them turning to street level drugs that are laced with other types of synthetic substances. So here's what we have. We have heroin, which is the poppy that they have become accustomed to. Drug dealers will say, this much heroin yields this much street value, and they would go out there and sell it. But what they've done now is said, this much heroin can yield this much profit if they mix it with the much cheaper and more readily available synthetic opioid. And this is when you hear fentanyl and carfentanil. So put it in perspective, fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine. Fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin, which is a strong substance. Carfentanil is 100 times more potent than fentanyl, which means a couple of grams would kill 150 people that are in the room because of its airborne potencies. So now we're seeing this being mixed with heroin, we're seeing it being mixed with cocaine, marijuana, and if you look at the numbers, okay, state of Florida, people are dying. Seminole County alone, the third most densely populated county per square mile in the state of Florida, we have a population of 500,000 people, very affluent community, wonderful schools, great businesses. We have had 650 overdoses last year, and that number is underreported. There's been 450 deployments of naloxone, Narcan, and there has been 82 deaths associated from an opioid-related drug use.
And Sheriff, when you say 650 overdoses, because I think it's so important for business leaders to understand this, this is a soccer mom. This is someone who was in the military. This is Kim's going to talk later about a friend of his who was a CEO of a company. This has broken, this opioid crisis has kind of broken our mold of who becomes addicted to drugs. Again, as a lifelong, disclaimer here, as a lifelong conservative, Republican, I have a master's degree in biblical divinity. You can't out-conservative me, I tell people.
Right.
This has challenged my beliefs that, people can just make the right choice and these drugs wouldn't be a problem if they're
You can't just
taking
abstain.
them. These drugs maybe, I think what you're saying that business leaders, one of the things they need to hear is, if you get addicted to these drugs, often by a doctor that you trusted, boy, it's not as easy as we might want to think to get off them.
It is extremely difficult. Actually, addiction specialists say it is twice as long of an effort to get off of the drugs before that mind starts working properly than even the time that they were dependent on the drug. This is a situation that we're trying to make sick people well, not bad people good. And I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, but I'm telling you right now, all of the people that we're coming in contact with work for you and your companies. They are mostly employed. They're living what appears to be a normal lifestyle, and they are overdosing at record numbers. And I will tell you, if you think about the number in the stat, 80% were at one time legally prescribed. My hypothesis is that number will then grow, and our youth will be a part of that equation, as this synthetic opioid is now being mixed with marijuana and other types of recreational drugs. If we don't come together right now and do something, these numbers will continue to increase.
Yeah, my biggest fear, one of the things I tell business leaders, we'll hear from Tony in just a second, and Kim as well. I think the data, just if you take it at first glance, where you're right, Florida has caught up, and we're going to stop both here and around the country pushing Oxy out at the level we do now. People are going to go to jail. Pharmaceutical companies are going to go bankrupt. Last year alone, there was an article, Kim, we've talked about this, prescription opioids down 19%, the scripts across America. Great, right? Well, the problem is what you hear from someone like Sheriff Lima is that person most likely is not just going to, if they're addicted, kick the habit.
Yeah.
It's almost, and again, for a business leader, it's hard to just accept that at face value. but we've seen some amazing people that we've known, family members, struggle with this. So those people, this is the fear I have, that all of those millions of people around America, and maybe, you know, hundreds of thousands in the state of Florida, when, as it's harder to get their prescriptions legally, and they're addicted, they're gonna turn to the streets in record numbers.
They turn to the streets in record numbers, and then suicide is on the rise as well. And I will tell you, the number one predictor of whether or not you will overdose and die is whether or not you've overdosed and survived. And that's a target group that we need to provide services to. They need assistance to break the habit. They just cannot do it on their own. It just does not happen. And we've seen it from time and time again in our facilities and in our treatment facilities and our correctional facilities alike.
So there's one last story on that, because again, I feel like when you get business leaders in the room, you know, myself included a year ago, and you hear a sheriff say, listen, you get addicted to these drugs, it's hard to get off these drugs, quit these drugs cold turkey if you become physically dependent. Dr. Aaron Wall, who we got a chance to meet, emergency room physician out of Lee County, Naples Lee Hospital System, he was describing, if you want to understand what it's like to withdraw from oxy or heroin, you can easily do that. You can understand that feeling today. All you have to do is go to a swimming pool and put yourself underwater for 90 seconds. The feeling you get at second 91 and 92, and you're still underwater, where your mind is telling you that you are dying, and that response from that part of your brain you're referring to that would do almost anything to save itself. That is the part of the brain that these drugs become attached to. That's what a withdrawal feels like from oxy, heroin, etc. So we do. Business leaders, I will tell you, there is a conversation that has to be had among business leaders, the faith community, elected officials. When is a choice not necessarily just a choice anymore? And I think that's going to be an important part of this conversation. And if you've got a sheriff from Seminole County telling us we're going to have to look at, we have a question I know that we had even before the webinar that someone sent in. Ask the sheriff why we can't just arrest these people and solve this opioid crisis.
Yeah,
What's your
I
answer
can
to
answer
that?
now. You absolutely cannot arrest your way out of this epidemic. Now, working in a county where we have a great relationship with our prosecutor, we do arrest the drug dealers. These people who have drug trafficking organizations, actually in Seminole County, we have been successful with charging 13 individuals with first-degree murder that have dealt deadly doses of drugs that have resulted in somebody's death. But we understand that this is a medical condition and not somebody's open choice. So what we're doing is we're doing a lot of diversion programs, we're offering assistance. All of that has to surround medical assisted treatment. We know that medical assisted treatment works, and there has to be a soft handoff between if somebody's involved in the criminal justice system and what they do on the outside. Let me give you just a couple of quick stats before I got to pass the opportunity here. We know right now that more than 10% of our population is genetically prone to addiction. We just don't know it yet. And this is one of the reasons why somebody can have a surgery or be prescribed a heavy dose of pain medicine, and one person can take it and say, you know what, that made my stomach turn, I'm sick to my stomach, I just can't take that. And another person can take it and say, wow, that is some powerful stuff, and it made me feel really, really good. We just don't know, and it takes just a matter of days before somebody becomes opioid dependent. The second thing that we know with absolute certainty is this. 1 out of every 3 people right now have a personal story of somebody that they know close to them that is navigating a path towards recovery. And the responsibility, the greatest responsibility for that matter, of any civilized society is to protect and to preserve human life. We can arrest people, we can put people in jail, but what we have to do is we have to understand that addiction and sometimes crime is a symptom of another problem. And if we want to make our community safer, we have to address the underlying conditions that lead people down that path in the first place.
Thank you, Sheriff.
Yep.
Don't go anywhere. We're
Yep.
gonna bring you back in a second. Tony Carbajal is the Vice President the head guy if you need something from the Florida Chamber Foundation. Your office in Tallahassee, huh?
Office in Tallahassee, I'm all over the state. And let me just start, Andre, by saying thank you so much for starting with the sheriff. I think most of us turn to law enforcement and think that this is a law enforcement issue, but where he ended was really important in saying each of us knows somebody that's affected. This comes into the office place because it's not the illicit drug, it's not the back alley thing at first. It's the family, it's the employee, the mother, the sister, the brother. This is a personal issue, and bridging from law enforcement to business, the reason I'm here is this is in the office. This is impacting us all. And we've been talking to our members, hearing stories around the state. Fortunately, not as bad as we can see in you, but we're seeing the consequences of this. We're seeing what is actually happening in the office.
Yeah, a business leader, he might not think that he has employees, people in his world that are addicted to these drugs, but the stat says, if you're watching this webinar, if you run a business of any size in the state of Florida, this is something you're dealing with maybe right underneath your nose.
Yeah, and ask yourself this. How many times have you heard somebody say, oh my gosh, my back hurts, or I just got a knee surgery, I had my wisdom tooth pulled, just got my shoulder work done. Those are the types of people we're talking about. These are not necessarily the people that are on the streets. These are the people that you and I are living with and working with. So
Yeah, in traveling, Tony's got some great information to share. I will say in traveling in this community and around the state, convening leaders to have conversations about this, I've never seen an issue where there are more people in a room that privately pull you aside and go, so just so you know, my brother is struggling with an addiction to Oxy, and he got it from his doctor. Or I had a guy last week in a business setting pull me aside and say, my wife has been on Oxy for 7 years. I have no idea what to do, and so we business leaders. This is something that it's probably affecting you already. Again, my thought, my concern is that the numbers say that it's going to be affecting us as we tighten legal ways to get Oxy, which is happening already. More and more businesses might see employees that are addicted to these drugs and turn to even illegal drugs.
yeah, and Andre, if you go to the next slide, I'll tell you what we're seeing. I mean, because what we've seen is what the sheriff gets to see sometimes is the end or the worst case scenario, but business leaders are seeing this in different ways. They're seeing it through absenteeism. They're seeing it through decreased performance on sometimes, folks that are getting extra procedures or that's fine. You're on the right one. So
He gave me the look like I was,
back.
okay, there we go.
Yeah, so there are safety concerns. There are a whole bunch of issues that we're not seeing it all the time in our offices with employees as the worst case scenario. We're seeing these as the little things that happen all the time. Imagine somebody who's complaining sometimes or complaining about somebody else who is expressing challenges or problems. So these are impacting productivity. These are impacting the workplace safety scenario. These are impacting our performance as a team in many different ways. I'll tell you another place that it really shows up is turnover and retention. When you get closer and closer to that point of crisis, which isn't difficult with these types of drugs that we're dealing with, turnover starts happening. And when you're starting to see it, and it's not one population. You can't just paint a picture of one individual, male, female, young, old. We're talking about anybody can be affected by this crisis.
Now, Tony, the Florida Chamber Foundation, for those that don't know, the right arm of the Florida Chamber, you help set the vision for the Chamber. A lot of times with an issue like the opioid crisis or other social issues, business leaders, I think, should be comfortable looking at the financial ramifications of poverty, homelessness, the opioid crisis. It's okay if compassion drives us and we have a heart for those struggling in our family of communities, but real solutions, in my opinion, don't happen until you also understand the business case for a community, for a state. I think what I hear you saying is the more people are addicted to these drugs, and if that number's growing, it's going to affect our companies, and it's going to affect our shared prosperity in Florida.
Yeah, so clearly business is compassionate. We've become a family. We spend more time often in our offices than in our homes, and that in itself is a challenge. But the reality is we need to be thinking about everybody who we're connected with. Sometimes it's not even the person that you're is in your workplace. It could be a family member. I am going to challenge anybody who's listening today to just ask around. There is no doubt in my mind that I don't care how small or large your office is, you know somebody that has been impacted by this directly. Just reach out to the audiences you have, and that's actually an important thing to do because we've got to start having conversations about the safety issues and the challenges. I mean, this hides in the dark corners of our offices, not necessarily because of the illicit nature, although people are using or misusing some of these things. It hides behind us not talking to each other. Actually, we've been talking to business leaders and asking them for some recommendations. So folks have been sending us some suggestions building on a portfolio of items that they wanted us to share. What can business do? You know, because sometimes it's a legal issue, sometimes it's a healthcare issue, sometimes it is outside of the offices. But if you're bounded by the space of whatever you call an office, there are some things that you can do, some things to consider like prevention, you know, safety and wellness and a culture of wellness and discussing these types of things actually is something that you can do and start opening the conversations. But there's also the awareness that can go on. Think about the risks that are in your office places. Think about promoting safe use of medication. I am not young, so I've had back issues.
You still look great, though.
Thank you very much. I was fishing there, so thank you so much for biting. But you know what? So looking at my back, my wife having her shoulder done, we've got to be thinking that these are risks that we've got to be understanding of what the door that is opening. And we can help each other as family members in an office or as employers to employees because our productivity is ultimately going to be impacted. What we want to do is train and support, maybe tell managers what to be looking for. Hey, have you had an employee who's gone to the dentist a little bit more often than not? These sound simple and it sounds intrusive if you're caring about these things, but these are signs that we ignore at our own peril.
I just want you to know, they sound simple, but trying to get business leaders, faith leaders, and law enforcement to have these conversations openly, some of the toughest conversations you can have in a society. So I agree with you that we got to look at new ways of having this conversation.
Yeah, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation today. I know Kim's going to come up and talk about some personal stories, making that case that this is in business and we're all related to it. But I just want to highlight, look, we can assist folks. There can be clear, appropriate, compassionate, and coordinated policies that help people, that make it a safe place to empower solutions. Everything from maybe EAPs, employee assistance programs, to healthcare solutions, but also be thinking about a recovery-friendly solution. And I'm not talking about, detoxing in the office place. What I'm talking about is how do you figure out when somebody is sick, when somebody has been injured, that they can come in and feel safe with their colleagues in an office and know that we are all looking out for each other. Not the prying, but really just being supportive in that nature.
The culture around if someone's struggling.
Yeah, so when you're talking about involving businesses and faith leaders and community leaders and a whole network of folks, those are all interrelated systems, right? But our cultures have to be interrelated as well. You don't just open the door in the morning and walk into a business and lose your family, lose your emotions. We are whole people, and I think that we've got to recognize that. So.
Yeah, if you're an employee, do you worry that if you were to share this with your HR department, you're going to get fired?
Yeah, so think about that. Somebody starts getting addicted to these drugs and they start thinking exactly that question. Do you have the type of office?
I wouldn't want to tell anyone that if I was addicted to it.
I'm a little nervous if the sheriff is sitting behind me, so I'm just imagining.
That's why I put
and he's a good guy, so.
That's why I put you between him and I. But again, go into your church and tell your pastor, hey, great news, I'm addicted to Oxy. I mean, the culture that we've probably had over a lot of years when it comes to addiction, mental health issues, trauma, that's going to be a big part of how we assist people.
Audrey, if I could just interject there, just for one moment, but I want to make sure that people understand that we do have a Good Samaritan law, where if there's somebody that is, with another individual and they do overdose, they can contact law enforcement, and the law does not allow for prosecution. So one of the big concerns here is because of that fear that we kind of joke back and forth with, because of that fear, some people have walked away from deadly situations because they were afraid that they would be held accountable and responsible. There's a Good Samaritan law in the state of Florida that if you're using drugs or you're with somebody who's using drugs and they pass out and they go unconscious, call 911, call us out there, and you will not be facing criminal prosecution as a result of that.
Yeah, that's important, and I would say, Tony, because I want you to get through your presentation, because we will all interrupt you endlessly, starting with me.
I actually think these are great conversations.
No, it is, and it's interesting that we, again, we have to put a law in place to counteract the culture that would eliminate someone from doing that,
Right.
even if someone's life is on the line, which again, not to get too far to the end of the big idea here, but if we're gonna solve this opioid crisis, the reason we're talking to business leaders
Right.
and faith leaders is because it's gonna start with the culture and the mindset changing. Our laws, the money we spend in Tallahassee, that follows what we believe. If
Yeah.
we believe wrong, we'll never do anything different.
The bottom line is one situation, but the culture has to be a big one. And Sheriff, I'm so glad you reminded us of that, because it did remind me. Look, the business leaders that are watching probably have an AED in their office, automatic defibrillator somehow, and can find something. But do they have Narcan?
Yeah.
Do they have, are
I
they
bet
prepared
most
for the-
don't.
I bet most don't. So look and see. If you don't, maybe that's a statement about the culture that you have. It's not negative. Look, what we're trying to do is evolve in this process.
Yep.
Thinking about our community, thinking about our employees, thinking about our families.
So for those that don't know, Narcan is a newly prolific drug that if someone's overdosing, you can administer it, anyone can administer it, and it will save their life. It will stop them from overdosing and dying. Oh, well, look at this, we have some.
Yeah, and
Sheriff, how would someone use this?
Yeah.
So this is injected through the nostril, and essentially this gives you 90 minutes of life. When somebody takes an opioid, the opioid attaches to the opioid receptors in the brain that calm you down to the point where it even tells your body to stop breathing. What this does is it goes through the nostril, it attaches to those opioid receptors in the brain, and it's an antagonist. It reverses the effect of the opioid for 90 minutes. That's why they have to be hospitalized within that 90 minutes, or they can go back into that overdose situation.
So what Tony was saying is, every business, let me hold on to this, every business could have this. But it's interesting, because I'm immersing myself in this of late. I've heard, and I know you've heard this before, Sheriff, Kim, you've heard this before. Well, I literally had someone say this to me last week. Well, doesn't that promote bad behavior with these addicts if we give them this? That was told to me.
It's some of the most ridiculous things that I've ever heard.
Yep, but the scary part is, and this is not a judgment as much as it is, because I got to tell you, I think wrong about everything the first time I look at it. So but Tony, we've got to change our belief system. Yeah. Business leaders, faith leaders, especially in the state of Florida, what they believe about these kind of things matters.
Yeah, that should be an AED in their mind. Nobody's thinking that I'm promoting French fries, although I probably have more than my share in that process. But Narcan is also a safety issue. It's a culture issue. It's a safety workplace issue.
Oh, that was your final.
Yeah, that's
so
it.
what would you say as I keep thinking you had one more slide, but I think we deleted it.
Yeah.
What would you say? What would be the big message to business leaders out there from you, a guy who works on so many issues in the state of Florida and has for a couple decades? What's the big message to business leaders on this rising opioid crisis?
So right now, it sounds like we're on the cutting edge or the beginning of a conversation, but as the sheriff said, we're 20 years behind already. So we've got to, don't worry about where you're at. Start wherever you're at, have these conversations, think about what's the door that is opening, who are the people that we're dealing with, what are the risks that are there, because the gateway is not some illicit drug that's starting out there. The gateway is a very simple drug that is being handed to you with a prescription by a caring doctor, and that says, we just want to keep you out of danger or pain for a little while as you recover. But the recovery sometimes never ends.
Yeah, again, we could spend hours talking about this, but this is potentially growing into the largest health crisis we ever seen.
It's huge.
And it's man-made.
Yeah.
We created this crisis through these drugs. So, all right, Tony, grab a seat. I'm gonna have Kim come up.
Thanks, Kim.
Kim Lobdrup.
Thanks,
Let me get your mug up here. Kim is the CEO of Red Lobster. So, if your soup was cold, we're gonna give you his personal email to email him about that. You have French fries at Red Lobster, right?
We do.
Okay, so French fries and lobster. That sounds good.
With sea salt. But
Sea salt, okay.
Yes.
So Kim is very involved in a new initiative that Central Florida is doing by the name of Project Opioid. Project Opioid is about 6 months old, and it's a business and faith leader-driven conversation and work on this opioid crisis. Kim, why would someone, you're a busy guy, you've got restaurants, not in Central Florida, not in Florida, not just in the United States, but around the world. Why would you get involved with a business leader initiative to help curb and help those that are addicted to these drugs?
Right. Well, Sheriff Lima and Tony, I think, did a great job talking about the scope of the crisis and the economic cost, but honestly, this is a crisis with tremendous human cost, and I had 3 friends who really brought that home to me. One is a very good friend of mine who I've known for many years, wonderful parent, wonderful human being, and his son got addicted to opioids. And we met regularly over a period of many years, so I got to see all of the things he went through, have all the, his son trying to get clean, going through a rehabilitation center, then, falling off the wagon, and then going through another one, and this journey he went through for years. Now, the good news is he was his son was one of the success stories. His son is today alive and clean, but that family went through hell for many years. My friend spent about $400,000 on all the rehabilitation, had to take out a second mortgage on his home. And honestly, while his son has recovered well, I think about what could have been had he not gotten through this experience in terms of where he would be in life.
And he wrote a book about this.
He wrote a fabulous book. It's called On Pills and Needles by Rick Van Warner. Excellent book. Great way to get to learn about this crisis and what it's like to go through it.
And one of the striking parts of Rick's story and his son's story, which, by the way, I think it's good for business leaders to hear this, although that's obviously so wonderful that his son lived, most people don't live. Sheriff, that correct? Most people on that pathway lose their life?
I think there's a high percentage that lose their life, but I think that most people who are addicted are still alive at this point, been battling their addiction, but I think statistically they're alive, but their future is so unknown.
Gotcha. So his success story is
This
great.
was a success story.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But listen, and by the way, we'll put the link out to everyone for the On Pills and Needles book. But what Kim is saying is this gentleman Rick, who CEO of a large company, good family, his son got on these drugs, and the journey to recovery was something hard to imagine.
Yes, and that was a success story. So let me tell you about a second friend, which was not a success story. There was another person who was a friend who started a company that made ultra-healthy food. He was a health food nut. He actually had this patented technology that was absolutely brilliant and was able to demonstrate clinically it greatly reduced the risk of dying after heart surgery, among other things. So this is a really smart individual, he's got it together, really health conscious, and in fact, I was so impressed with him, I invested personally in his company. A few years later, he died mysteriously and suddenly, and I found out he was in fact addicted to opioids. And again, last person in the world you would expect to have that kind of problem, and yet he is dead. He is dead. I have a third friend who is another really brilliant guy named Brad Brex, who's Harvard MBA, used to run Epcot Center for Disney, used
President
to run
of
a
Epcot.
funeral home chain. And through his experience in the funeral home chain, noticed all these people dying, and that there was an incredible number of people dying young from opioid addiction. And he did a lot of research on it. And he educated me with some really startling statistics. For example, just a few. In the United States, 3 million. In the United States, of people who become abusers of opioids, 3/4 start with a prescription medication.
They don't start with heroin.
No, they're following doctor's orders. 3/4. Secondly, In the United States, 3 million people a year have wisdom tooth surgery. Just to take one thing specifically, 3 million people a year have wisdom tooth surgery. 99% leave with a prescription for opioids. Someone who is taking opioids for one day has a 6% chance of becoming addicted. Someone who takes opioids for 30 days has a 35% chance of becoming addicted. And once someone is addicted, according to Harvard, it typically takes 8 years and 4 to 5 attempts to come clean if it's one of the rare success stories, if they're one of the success stories. So this is a serious issue. My friend Brad Rex started eHome Counseling Group to help people with counseling for opioid addiction recovery. But he's gotten involved in Project Opioid as well.
Yep, and again, we don't have a ton of time, we're gonna get you off this webinar by 1 o'clock. But I strongly urge any business leader to dive into what fentanyl is, because fentanyl is what has really changed. Being addicted to oxy, being addicted to heroin, these are terrible drugs that can kill you. But fentanyl, those that relapse on a synthetic opioid like fentanyl, their risk of dying is so much higher than anything we've seen previously. And if you look at the underpinnings of this incredibly steep rise in deaths, it's because of fentanyl, a drug coming from, Sheriff, coming from China, coming from Mexico, that's going to be hard to just get off the streets overnight. Let me take a few, and you can just stand right there, Kim, and you know, you're looking good there. So let me take you for just a couple minutes through what Project Opioid is. If you're in Central Florida, we want to have you get involved in this new business and faith leader initiative on the opioid crisis. If you're someone around the state, we're gonna be talking to you, whether it's through our partnership with the Florida Chamber Foundation, groups like Leadership Florida, or just community leaders around the state. Business leaders have to get involved on this opioid crisis. It's something, it is growing into the largest public health crisis we've ever seen in Florida. And so Project Opioid is a Central Florida-based initiative. Here's a couple things that business leaders, whether you're in Central Florida or around the state, we just want you to leave with. By the way, we'll send you this PowerPoint and a link to it right after the webinar. But one, to solve or find solutions to the opioid crisis in your community. You might be in Jacksonville, you might be in South Florida, in Miami, or anywhere in one of the rural communities. It's going to take statewide partnership to see progress. I will tell you, some issues, Tony, a community can handle maybe a little more autonomously. They don't necessarily need as much help on a statewide cooperative policy, a resource collaboration level. You know, homelessness, just one example of an issue that cities, communities have a lot of ability to make progress, even if their neighbors 50, 100, 200 miles away in another community choose not to adopt the same programs. The opioid crisis is not that way. It's about what you do in your local community, but it's going to take statewide partnerships, and so we're going to want to have big conversations with business leaders around the state as well. The second big takeaway for business leaders is you got to get your whole community involved. I know the sheriff is really passionate about this in Seminole County, and Tony, this is really the backbone of what you do every day on a lot of issues, but we've got to have the business community who's not often at the table on an issue like the opioid crisis, but we've also got to get nonprofits and education and obviously government, healthcare, criminal justice, people that fund solutions, philanthropy, and faith-based organizations. We have to change both our culture, our belief system on this issue, and we also have to bring all the leaders to the table to do that. That's the second big thing I would say. The third big takeaway, and I think this is one of the most important things, and Tony was alluding to this in his presentation. Currently, the frontline response system to this opioid crisis and those that are overdosing and dying is the sheriff's office, EMT, and hospitals in their emergency rooms. You know, you show up, Sheriff Lima said the greatest indication that you are going to overdose is that you overdosed previously. We have to create a new front line on this issue, and that's got to be businesses, through HR departments, through EAP programs. It's got to be churches. It's got to be your ability to talk to your faith community. And it's got to be a bigger conversation where people know how to connect someone with help before they're overdosed and dying in a police officer's vehicle or in an emergency room. And so those are kind of three takeaways and three areas that Project Opioid is going to focus on. I don't want to, Kim has told 3 stories, and thank you for sharing those. This is actually something that business leaders also need to know. We're making the business case to you, but real people who are dying during this crisis. And this is a mom. I won't show her face. I won't tell you her name, but this is a photo she sent me. Her son. She sent me a text before we did our first Project Opioid meeting in January, where she said, "I want you to tell the leaders in that room that my son was a 4.3 GPA student at a local high school. He went to a local college and got his engineering degree, and he was an all-state athlete, and he was the strongest person I ever met, but he met a drug in oxy and then in heroin and fentanyl that was stronger than him." And she sent me this text, and it brought tears to my eyes when I read it. Tell these leaders that this was who my son was, not the person the drugs made him. So real people are affected by this. I have a couple questions here before we go that you guys were asked. This one's for Tony. Tony, is this simply a healthcare issue that businesses need to address, or is it something beyond healthcare in your opinion?
No, I think Tim highlighted that this is a personal issue. It's not just a healthcare issue, it's a business issue. It's a bottom line. Look, if you want to be brass tacks, the productivity loss, the impacts from absenteeism, the challenges that you're going to experience in the workforce makes this a bottom line issue. But it's a personal issue, it's a community issue, and truly, I challenge each of you just to start asking around if you know anybody who's been impacted like this, and then you're going to realize that it's a family issue, that it's a community issue, that it is pervasive. And you don't have to just get to the sheriff to see this point. Kim, I appreciate your story so much because it's a big issue. So.
Yep. Question for Sheriff Lima. Sheriff, again, people asking, why can't law enforcement simply crack down on those who are using these drugs as a deterrent to this addiction crisis?
Quite frankly, it doesn't work. I mean, you see a level of recidivism, and how many people do you know out there that have been addicted to tobacco, but simply cannot stop? They've tried to stop time and time again. Opioid is 10 times more addictive than tobacco is. So it's this revolving door. We've tried to arrest as many people as we can. The last thing I'll mention to the business community is we've already heard, and you know, that the majority of people's conscious hours are in your presence and the people who you employ to lead them. Sometimes the first time we can see things is through performance and behavior. And I think that the business community is probably the most uniquely positioned community to notice the early stages of this epidemic. Our families and our work families. So this is a very, very important thing to kind of look at. Every act of gun violence and every act of or vehicle crash combined is about half of the people that are dying of this epidemic.
Kim, question for you. What is the effectiveness, and this is actually probably for everyone here, what would be the effectiveness of drug screenings? Couldn't we use drug screenings to help come up? By the way, logical question from a business owner, business leader. What is the role of drug screenings in an opioid crisis? Can it play a role, or is it is maybe that an old school thought that maybe its day is past?
I mean, if you think about the crisis as a whole, a drug screening will not stop anyone from getting addicted in the first place, nor will it help them. I mean, a drug screening could potentially keep someone who is already addicted from being employed by a company, but that does absolutely nothing to stop people from becoming addicted or help them become cured once, once they've gotten addicted.
Sheriff, drug screenings?
They may be legally prescribed.
Okay.
They may be legally
That-
prescribed the drug and then addicted at the same time.
Yep, that was my first
Yep.
thought is a drug screening would pick up Oxy, and you're on Oxy legally.
Yeah, you got a script.
You got a
Yep,
script for
so-
it. So again, a very, very, very complex issue. Tony, this
You know,
question.
and by the way,
Oh, go ahead.
we're risk averse to in many ways as businesses. Look, we're not going to just presume the employees and that we
Yeah.
have all the time are in a bad situation, right?
Right. I would also just add, a drug screening could only pick up whether the employee themselves were
Right.
addicted, even in the best case, and more often than not, it's a family member who actually has the problem.
Yeah.
I think another thing that's interesting as well is this should extend beyond the employee and extend to the employees' families. Because a lot of our employees are being covered by our insurance for the entire family. And I think that that is a huge component that can help us, because sometimes the person that is navigating their course to recovery or addicted, they don't realize that they're a problem. That rational thought of the brain is not telling them. They're still going to work every day, they're still earning a paycheck, but sometimes it's reaching out to their family members and the company working with those other people who have a vested interest in an individual's success is the key.
And you're still gonna see that represented in the absenteeism and the insurance
Yeah.
costs and all those other items. So there are signs, there are warning signs to some degree.
Tony, this question's for you. How are the social determinants of health being considered as this crisis evolves? How should they be considered?
So, that's a fancy way of saying the context. There are a lot of things like jobs and education and how health and family and our care all play into this. But I'm going to just go back to what Kim just emphasized in the last comment. These may be legal situations. We don't necessarily start in the worst case scenarios. We start in a situation where you were trying to get health care, you were trying to do the right thing, you were trying to get healthier, whatever it may be, and you can end down the wrong path. That said, there are folks that are living at risk or on the edge, and Sheriff, hats off to what you and the deputies have to deal with day in and day out. But that's a downstream type of situation. Businesses have a unique role where we can be thinking about these things. You don't have to be concerned about every single determinant that is causing this, but be concerned about what you can notice and where you can intervene.
There's a new book out, it's actually only a few weeks old, called The United States of Opioids. And in this book, it's actually the best, most comprehensive book I've ever read on the topic. I'm going to buy all of you guys a copy of it. But this gentleman talks about the crisis from 7 different perspectives. But one of them, and how that convergence of course, all these drugs prolifically being poured in legally through the pharmaceutical companies, as the sheriff was describing, this environment where then now we've contracted those drugs, whether it's through the cracking down on pill mills, cracking down on doctors. But then he also talks about, and we have to be cognizant of this, that we do live in a society in 2019, although we're the most prosperous nation that's ever existed, and Florida is tremendously prosperous. There are a lot of people struggling right now. There are a lot of people who have trauma in their past. There are folks who are stressed out. The culture of their own life and family is. We have suicide is up apart from addiction. So I do think it is important to have a healthy discussion about what drives addiction even beyond. That's why the behavioral health side of this is important as well.
And Andre, to your point, and what I tried to do is talk about there is a legitimate use of opioid. There is a population out there that are deserving of significant pain relief, and we have to make sure that what we do doesn't unintentionally victimize people who may be suffering.
Yep. Yeah, it's a very, very good point that one of the unintended consequences of this this tightening of prescriptions for opioids is that those that do have tremendous pain and pain that is legitimate are sometimes now struggle to get that. The problem though, even with me saying that, is the next thought in my head is, if I was addicted to these drugs, I would make up any excuse.
Well, you're dope sick.
I'm dope sick.
Dope sick. Your pain is your addiction.
Yeah, and so now a doctor's standing there, thinking to himself or herself, every prescription I write could be my ticket to a lawsuit, or at some point my ticket to a criminal prosecution. And so it's this convergence though, Tony, of this unprecedented, prolifically powerful drug to tens of millions of Americans, now a contraction of that drug at the moment where so many people are doing well. I give the Florida Chamber tremendous credit, Mark, you and the team there, because you're having a big conversation about poverty and about those struggling in our state, and I think that's important. And in relation to the opioid crisis, if we have a community or a state where a lot of people are struggling, and where they're legally prescribed these drugs, boy, you gotta expect that addiction is going to be prolific. So as we wrap up, we have 2 minutes left. I want to give a big thank you to Kim Lopdrup, CEO of Red Lobster. Again, email him all your complaints on cheese biscuits or anything.
I've never had a complaint.
I love Red Lobster. We're going to Red Lobster next week.
It's a fantastic choice.
It is a great choice. And so, Kim, thank you for your leadership on this issue. One of our executive leaders of Project Opioid. We'll have more links to Project Opioid in the follow-up email and right below you in the GoToMeeting bar. But 5 months old, but it's our realization that we can't leave law enforcement out there on their own. We can't leave the hospitals out there on their own. It's going to take the entire community to address this issue. Sheriff Dennis Lima, amazing community leader from Seminole County. He's one of our leaders of Project Opioid and really one of the statewide leaders on this issue. Works closely with Ashley Moody in Tallahassee, and I'm sure you'll be working with the new drug czar. But a guy who says, listen, law enforcement is the front lines, but we're going to have to be open-minded. For another webinar, for more conversations in the future, we're going to have to learn about medically assisted treatment. If someone is addicted to heroin and they started on Oxy and now they're overdosing on fentanyl, if we do not help them get medically assisted treatment, which is something I've learned about recently, and I'm sure a lot of you business leaders out there are just learning about, boy, we can put them at great risk if we do not offer them, for a season of time at least, a bridge to break their addiction. So Sheriff Lima, thank you. And Tony Carvajal of Florida Chamber Foundation, thank you for being a part of this. You drove the longest, so you get credit. And again, to all the business leaders out there, we're going to send you more information. We're putting together and should have in the next few days 7 most important things that business leaders need to know about the opioid crisis in Florida. We'll be putting that out prolifically, both here and again around the state. And we encourage you to get involved if you're in Central Florida in Project Opioid. And if you're not in Central Florida and you're a business leader, get involved, get educated, and come together. Business leaders should have an opinion on the opioid crisis, and their leadership is going to be necessary in forming solutions in your community and beyond. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll be talking to you again soon. Take care.